Yeah, so thank you so much for attending. So today I'm going to be talking about our work. This project, we call it Influence Government. So it's about targeted advertising in prevent, criminal justice, and far, far beyond. So this is a collaboration with Strathclyde and the University of Edinburgh, based on research that we originally sort of started at the University of Cambridge. And it's myself and Daniel will be presenting today, but also on this project are Gemma Flynn at Strathclyde and James Stewart of Science and Technology and Innovation Studies in Edinburgh. So I don't know if you can see that, apologies. There we go. There we go. I'll just get rid of that. Okay, so today, essentially, what we're going to be talking about is how target advertising and what are often called influence campaigns, and I'll explain what those are being used by the police, by security services, and by everyone else, by basically all the government departments we've actually looked into, for kind of delivery of frontline social policy in the UK. So target advertising and the use of sort of digital influence is often thought about through the idea of surveillance capitalism. This is one of the main ways this is talked about. So this is this idea that online platforms provide services for free. So things like Facebook, Twitter, Google, they provide us these digital services, but they're collecting information about us all the time. And the service is actually paid for by the sale of advertising profiles that are used to target these supposedly very effective digital, very highly targeted adverts. This has been generally spoken about in the terms of kind of political stuff. So it's about how this has been used for corporate advertising, but also political disinformation, political campaigns. This kind of stuff is where most literature is on this, but there's very little on its use by government for social policy. And our research on this is really seeing this as a new emerging technology of control in society, which we call influence government, or in justice, influence policing. And this is about this merging of these sort of David Cameron era ideas of behaviorism in social policy, the merging of these with influence infrastructures from the private sector. And this is really becoming a kind of a front line of social policy. So in the talk today, Daniel's going to be speaking first. He's going to talk about essentially a sort of data story of how we discovered this was happening and how we became interested in it, and eventually felt a sort of moral imperative to research it. And then I will talk a bit further about the subsequent research we've done since then and our attempts to understand what on earth is actually going on here. We'll be talking a bit about the kind of ethics, power, and accountability issues that this raises. And as a disclaimer for this talk, this is a critical piece of work. If there's people in the audience who are involved in doing this or kind of stuff, it's not our intention to say that this is a sort of evil thing that's necessarily terrible and bad, but we are going to focus on some of the critical aspects in this talk. So with that, I will pass over to Daniel.
Great, thank you. Okay, so how do we get into this? Well, we were measuring global cybercrime levels because that's a fun thing to do, and we were looking at a specific crime type, UDP reflection distributed denial of service attacks, because that's something that we could measure. Globally, we can see nearly all of these kinds of attacks across the whole world. We know who's being attacked, we know when they're being attacked, and we know how they're being attacked. And that's something you don't necessarily get for many crime types. And I'm not going to go into the details of how that works exactly, but to give you a little bit of an idea, we have a network of honeypots, which are devices that pretend to be things that can be abused to do attacks. And if you look at the figure, then the attacker sends their attack via these reflectors. And we pretend to be the reflectors, so we see the traffic that the attacker sends to reflectors, and that enables us to see their attempts at doing these attacks. And this is really useful because it means we can see what happens when interventions are made. So we can evaluate interventions that have happened as a result of actions by police or other parties to see what effect they had on the level of crime. And we can do this on a daily or weekly granularity, or even hourly. And maybe some of those results might be more widely applicable to other crime types that are harder to measure. And we're only measuring one particular very narrow type of distributed denial of service attack. There are other kinds of denial of service attack we can't measure nearly so easily, and there are also all sorts of other types of cybercrime, but maybe some of the results might generalize. Next slide, please. So what we did is we take the global weekly number of attacks that we've observed, and then Ben produced a regression model that models the trend over time and accounts for things like seasonality. And what we found was that for every statistically significant drop in our observed data, we were able to, they correlated with a particular intervention. Some interventions we knew about didn't have impact, but many of them did. And that was quite interesting, and we were able to then do some more work based on that. Can we have the next slide? So that led to some other papers, because we didn't just collect data about kind of from a computer science perspective on number of attacks. We also collected a whole load of qualitative data, that were interviews, data from chat channels, and so we were also able, basically Ben was able to find out a lot about why this was happening as a result of talking to law enforcement and talking to the people who were actually responsible for running these crime types. And I'm not going to talk about these papers, but they're lots of fun and you should read them. But we're particularly for today going to look at per country effects, because this is what led us to this particular line of research. So we go to the next slide. So we were able to pull out which country attacks are targeting, because we know the IP address of the victim, so we know where the victim is. We don't know where the attacker is, but we know where the victim is. We were talking to the NCA, and they told us that they had run a Google Ads campaign for a period of about 6 months. And this had cost them something in the region of £3,000, a bit less, which is pretty cheap as a law enforcement intervention, in fact, and much cheaper than basically all the other interventions that we looked at. And during that 6-month period, the levels of attacks in the UK did not increase. They were basically flat. And that might not seem particularly interesting, except for the fact that before and after this period, the UK attack levels were strongly correlated with US and other countries, and in those countries, attack levels went up. So this intervention may well have caused the levels of crime to not increase when they otherwise would have done, and over an extended period. And the NCA was really excited when we told them about this. They were, because they had no way of knowing whether what they'd done had any effect or had been useful, or whether they just wasted £3,000 by giving it to Google. And we were able to show that, well, it looks like it might well have been quite effective. And they went and they propagated this exciting success story all the way up to the Home Secretary. And they told us about this. And at this point, we've suddenly had a little bit more of a think about this, because, well, this is an interesting early result, and we think it's probably quite useful and probably likely to be more widely applicable, but it's not a particularly strong evidence base. And I don't live very far away from Kenmure Street. And just because the Home Secretary likes something does not necessarily mean that it's going to have legitimacy at a local or national level. So we then felt a moral imperative to do some more research on this area about not just how do we use targeted advertising to suppress crime, but also when and if and should, and all these other kinds of questions around this more broadly, and that's what led us to the research that Ben is going to talk about now.
Thanks so much, Daniel. Yeah, so what we first did was we started speaking to the NCA, and we said, okay, so what's actually going on here? Is this just they put these targeted adverts out, targeted at the people who are committing these attacks or purchasing these attacks from attack services, and it's had this effect? So what's actually going on? And it turns out this isn't just the NCA buying targeted advertising. They're carrying out very sophisticated, these are part of a much more sophisticated influence operation. So firstly, this isn't just a message that these people are seeing at any time, or kind of the people who do these kind of attacks are seeing as they browse the internet. These are occurring in immediate context when they're searching for particular keywords associated with looking for these attack services and buying these and selling these attacks. And we then looked a bit further and we found out there's all these other practices happening. The NCA are blending operational data of different kinds with their messaging. They're carrying out surveillance of groups that they think are at risk of getting involved in this behavior. They're carrying out focus groups with these groups. They're then finding people who've not yet committed crimes, picking them up, these are often kids, and then scaring their parents with these sort of knock and talk interventions. They're then doing these long sort of debriefing sessions with these kids where they're gathering not only data about these kind of what they see as risk factors for offending, but also cultural data about what music are you listening to, and they're using that to sort of develop and target the kind of content of these adverts. This blew us away when we found out about this. It's this kind of, they're really using the techniques and approaches of like a marketing agency, this kind of profiling, audience segmentation, generation of cultural knowledge, but crucially theories of change, and sort of they're developing these theories of offending. So essentially, we thought this was fascinating, and we thought, well, you know, like, how do we actually explain this? Because when we dug further, we found this approach in the police, in health departments, basically throughout governments. We thought, what's actually going on? Here, next slide. So as we kind of looked into this, we found that this is basically a sort of, we can explain this as part of the rise of nudge and the rise of behaviourist forms of government in the UK. So we can see these as a part of the broader movement towards public health preventative approaches to social policy. So we see this arising particularly under David Cameron and Lake Gordon Brown, this idea of nudge. So this idea that social policy can, as a development of these kind of modernist ideas of social policy, shaping the built environment, shaping institutions to change how people live and work and to solve social problems. This is about social policy in quite a holistic way, intervening in the architecture of individual decisions and behaviours made by people. And this can include shaping material conditions. So we see this through things like anti-homelessness architecture, sort of the design of buildings and things like this, but also drawing in things like trying to shape culture, trying to shape individual psychology. And in terms of the professional side of this draws from marketing, but also behavioral economics, behavioral psychology, and also things like the techniques developed, for example, in the Cold War propaganda, psyops, and soft power. And this is about shaping the decision landscape of people in this holistic way. So this was located initially in the sort of this team within government called the Behavioural Insights Team, or the Nudge Unit. And its sort of interventions are things like, for example, economic interventions might be sort of tweaking the minimum unit pricing of alcohol. The sort of behavioural stuff might be putting labels on tobacco to kind of, in the moment, shape what people think and how they make these decisions. And this has been it's certainly been successful as a policy because it's been really sort of spread throughout government. They've been very entrepreneurial about this. And they've also started claiming other stuff is nudge as well. So they claimed that, for example, the work of the Glasgow VRU, this has been claimed as a sort of victory for nudge, even though it's not really conceived within that sort of broad philosophy. Now, this has quite a contested relationship with democracy. It's very sort of top down. It's very sort of, you know, it's not really the same as these kind of like democratic, responsive, accountable sort of things. And it's very sort of, yeah, the idea that social problems are essentially issues with individual decision-making by people within kind of communities that are perceived as risky. So in combination with this, we have the targeted ads ecosystem. So this is often thought about through this idea of surveillance capitalism, which I met before, which is this idea that online services are provided generally for free through these big integrated extensive platforms like social media platforms or search infrastructure like Google. But that through cookies and other forms of surveillance and data gathering, you pay for your use of these platforms effectively with your data. It's sold, it's used to develop quite intimate profiles, not only of your demographic characteristics, but also of your behaviors and your past history of what you've been doing, what you've been looking at. These profiles are sold in secondary and tertiary markets, and they're used by marketing consultancies to deliver very complex forms of, or at least what they see as very complex forms of targeted advertising, not only about who you are, but what you're doing in particular contexts. This is additionally linked to the use of influencers, so individuals on these platforms who've developed a big following, who are able to, who are influential within big or small communities, who can be tapped by media companies to provide sponsored content to put messages out there. And this tends to develop as a cycle. So we see this kind of classic marketing consultancy cycle where you develop some sort of message you want to get across, you target it using these target advertising infrastructures, and you A/B test. So you provide one message to one group, one message to another group, and you see which works best. And then you refine it, you contribute, this all contributes to your theory of sort of change. You refine the message, you do focus groups, you do more traditional forms of marketing and advertising, and you sort of develop this message iteratively. And in doing this, you're cultivating very deep and broad forms of knowledge, both the kind of classic sort of marketing ethnography, sort of like deep cultural forms of knowledge about communities, but also you're engaging with all this knowledge that the platform infrastructure is collecting about individuals. Now, as you can probably imagine, this is really attractive for government policy. For example, in the era of, in the pandemic, it's really useful for the government to be able to target messages at different groups. So there were certainly periods in the pandemic where actually what you were allowed to do, the guidance was different for different age groups, different people with different risk factors. And it's quite useful, for example, if there's a local lockdown in Manchester, to change the messaging you're putting out about the pandemic within Manchester, for example. But most of the critical work on this stuff focuses on the marketing side and the corporate side and the political side, rather than its use for policy. So our research, since we kind of found out this was going on, there's quite a lot of research on nudge and behaviorism as kind of social policy in the UK. But we're really interested in how this is being incorporated with sophisticated marketing and segmentation through these kind of target advertising infrastructures and the practices associated with them. We wanted to sort of scope out the use of these practices by the UK state and make sense of how these kind of fit together within the history of technologies of power in the UK. What we found was this is happening everywhere. So we initially thought, oh, well, sort of this is Dominic Cummings sort of coming into government and he's putting all this behaviorist sort of targeted ad stuff like he did with Cambridge Analytica. But it turns out this has nothing to do with Dominic Cummings. This has been going on for ages. This is really emerged out of this kind of broad behaviorist approach to government. It's happening in health, it's happening in transport, it's happening in immigration, welfare. The police are using this, the NCA are using this. Everyone seems to be using these approaches now. And we found 4 really distinct forms of how this is being enacted. And these have increasing levels of decentering away from traditional vectors of policy and accountability. So I'm going to go through these in turn just now. The first of these is what we kind of call the naive use of targeted ads. So this is where basically Google's just being used as a billboard. You've got your advert that you're already putting on in magazines, leaflets, brochures, in the local news, and you just bring some Google ads in there as well as a line item in your advertising budget. There's not much feedback, not much continuous development, and not really any targeting. And so this is what the COVID ads were like at the start of the pandemic, basically. Everyone was getting the same adverts, basically in Scotland, just saying, this is what government policy is, that's it. And while some of this is still different, it's online, it's in particular contexts, people can react to it in different ways for offline ads, this isn't necessarily as interesting. So this is what we're really interested in. This is the formation of complex professional practice around targeted advertising and the use of essentially influence operations. And this is the kind of level of sophistication at which Police Scotland and the NCA are at just now. So this is not just the use of the advert space as a billboard, but actually pulling in operational data, but we gathered by these organizations. This might be about prisoners, it might be about potential offenders, it might be about patients, these kind of things. And using this to develop a theory of change that the advert's actually using. It is very sophisticated in practice, and it's rarely just the ad on its own. It often uses sort of these focus groups, surveillance, direct interventions that are used to kind of tailor and target the ads iteratively. Within the civil service, this is actually a core part of the government communication services competency framework. So communication professionals within government, the use of these kind of methods are increasingly part of the kind of advanced stages of their main competency framework. And we're seeing this either directly transferred to law enforcement or be reconstructed in its own right in law enforcement. So particularly within the NCA, this is all theorized under the PREVENT framework, essentially. And PREVENT itself has developed a lot of these advanced communications and advanced influence capacities to do this kind of policy. And it's becoming more widespread, particularly as the people who have these these competencies, people who've maybe worked in the private sector, marketing agencies, these are coming into government and they're moving around between government departments. And they're drawing in other kinds of government workers as well. So they're drawing in expertise from economists, statisticians, these kinds of things as well. And this is where we see this kind of iterative cycle start to become more apparent, where people are actually collecting data and developing a theory of change. Now, in justice particularly, we've, so Daniel and I's paper with some other Cambridge people, we talk about this as influence policing. And I'll talk a little bit about, in a bit more detail, about what this looks like within NCA Prevent. So this is actually part of, within the NCA, a much broader spread of the Prevent strategy, spreading far beyond radicalisation to other forms of crime. So there is now a sort of core Prevent cybercrime strategy and sort of a Prevent infrastructure around policing cybercrime through Prevent. But these techniques are also being used to police knife crime and gun crime and other forms of crime that the NCA are interested in. And they actually refer to these internally as well as influence operations. And these come from this essentially, like, there's been some really good writing about this within Prevent, not by us, which I can link to after the talk, but this is essentially an epidemiological understanding of offending. So the idea that crime can be thought of essentially as a kind of, as a disease or public health issue, where you have communities who are both risky to others and at risk themselves of falling victim to becoming offenders, essentially. And this revolves around sort of surveilling these communities, both through kind of the use of big data technologies and target advertising infrastructures, but also basic operational surveillance, community surveillance, to detect within these communities particular individuals who are particularly risky or perceived to be risky. And then we get these interventions. So with the cybercrime Prevent strategy, effectively they would send NCA officers around to these, this is often kids online who have not broken the law, but look like they're about to break the law or look like they're going to start getting into cybercrime. So they send an NCA officer around to their house to speak to their parents and carry out a long 2 or 3 hour debriefing interview. And in this debriefing interview, they're gathering a lot of data, which both informs their kind of model of change. So it's operational use as well to see, like, you know, is this a kid that could benefit from intervention? But it informs this model of change and it actually informs the targeted advertising they're developing. They then use this to tailor the adverts and the cultural interventions and run and develop these campaigns, observe, repeat in this kind of iterative way. In addition to this, just like a marketing agency, they're also using focus groups. So they take particular individuals they think might benefit from this. They get them together in a room with people from private companies and they say, you know, here's how you can have a positive future. But they also ask them questions that will help develop the adverts. In addition, the NCA is also using, at the same time, cultivating influencers and influence. So, you know, finding computer game companies or big conferences about video game conferences, things like this, getting ads in there, getting their message in there. They got in the computer gaming press, magazines, these kind of things, putting their adverts in there. And in doing this, the police are developing this very intimate cultural picture of, well, sorry, the NCA, of particular communities that are sometimes quite small communities. And through analysing these adverts, we thought it's really interesting because it is this kind of classic sort of PSYOPs approach where you're not just saying, don't do this behaviour. You're also always providing your own sort of version of the good citizen. So these sort of values, which are inevitably kind of entrepreneurial, consumerist, success focused. We can see this with this cybercrime ad here, where on the one hand, you've got this sort of very dreary, there's the threat of a police record, you've been banned from your gaming community. And on the other hand, the positive version, oh, look, you've got a job somewhere, you've won some money on a bug bounty, you've got all loads of pals, this kind of thing. And this is essentially about, from a critical perspective, this is about essentially the NCA and the police and these and other organizations that do this, effectively providing state-approved versions of what they perceive to be risky cultures. So where is this kind of culture shaping sort of thing? Additionally, there is a strong export market around the world for this wider conceptualization of Prevent. And there was an NCA officer I spoke to who said, it's a lot easier when we go to, for example, countries in around the world. He mentioned sort of particularly third world countries where the NCA does some of this sort of like teaching policing and stuff. He said, you know, it's a lot easier because we used to have to sort of put in all this infrastructure and give them all this training. And now we can just give them a laptop and sort of walk them through how to do these kind of influence policing things. What interested me as well was we kind of, so Daniel and I won't go into too much detail on this, but Daniel and I were sort of expecting Police Scotland to not be doing this kind of stuff, these kind of quite tailored influence interventions. But actually it turns out They do have a unit that does this in Police Scotland, and they're actually just as advanced as the NCA in doing this kind of very sort of marketing-based stuff. What was really, so this is one of the other ads. So this is the NCA's gun crime ad within this duty. And as you can see here really clearly, these are stills from a YouTube ad. We've got on the bottom these sort of clear threats. So don't blow it, threat of prison, years wasted, lives ruined, etc. But on the top, this is the kind of positive version of what you're meant to be going after. Lots of money, dollar, like pound signs, stuff, and love for your mum and community. So we can see this kind of quite, it is this kind of quite sort of consumerist capitalist citizen that's being promoted. So in terms of, I've got a little bit of time left, so I'll go into some of the kind of further detail around this. So this isn't just about the government though, because there is a private sector dimension to this as well. And this is the kind of next stage of this, where we see the bringing in wholesale of media consultancy networks. So these are kind of private sector media consultancies, often kind of startups and small businesses. Now, these are often used in a way that's sort of linked to the previous version, the kind of professional practice version. So they're often used to provide creative, provide kind of ad copy, and to buy targeted adverts for example, home office campaigns. But sometimes they're given the ball to run away with on their own. Sometimes they're contracted, particularly, you used to see this with the kind of prevent stuff a lot. But sometimes these companies are basically told it's a full service. These are our policy outcomes. This is some of the data. This is what we want you to do. And they go and they develop this full influence campaign on their own. And this is where you see this full cycle emerge. This is where they're often not just buying ads on Twitter. They're not just doing Google ads. They're linking to these much smaller social networks, smaller online platforms, much smaller communities, where they can actually cultivate one-to-one relationships with particular influencers and things like this. We also see that, weirdly, when we looked into it, there's a lot of ex-Tory and Labour MPs and ex-civil servants on the boards of these companies. But we're also seeing this is where you get this classic marketing stuff, the links to private sector databases, quasi-ethnographic methodology, this kind of marketing consultancy methodology. But actually, these companies are now delivering frontline preventative policy for duties like prevent and in health and across government. I won't go into the mosaic stuff, but it's quite interesting. This is where some of the big controversies have been as well. So if you think the really ill-conceived advertising in London, where anti-knife crime adverts were being put in fried chicken shops, for example, with this clearly sort of racist targeting sort of thing. This is where some of the really controversial stuff is happening. Finally, I realize there's quite a lot in this, so apologies, but yeah, finally we see the rise of these much bigger companies coming into this space. These are sometimes called government as a service companies. So this is like Palantir, G4S, PwC, these big logistics, securities and accountancy firms. But I think we've chosen, at least at this stage in the research, to call them governmentality as a service, because these people are not just selling government services en masse to government, they are selling ways of thinking about and doing and conceiving governments or governmentality to governments. These companies provide basically off-the-shelf huge technologies of government. They provide the capacity to do this big database management, whether it's sort of patients, all these, to integrate government data and to essentially provide the infrastructure for doing government, basically. The way their business model works is they effectively solve these problems of like, how do you build a patient database? How do you build an offender database? Solve this problem once, and then sell this solution to every government they can around the world, every department they can around the world. Now, obviously, Palantir and G4S are not engaging in a huge amount of corporate ethnography, but they are solving the scale aspects of these issues. They're tracking, collecting operational and corporate data, and boiling all this stuff down into dashboards for the use of sort of targeting and these kind of policies. And they also are bringing in these links to the existing policy domain systems they manage, so the databases of people that are in prison, things like this. So what we're effectively seeing is that the rise of this behaviorist sort of epidemiological model within government has led to basically comms becoming this policy center, these sort of places where the communication professionals are sort of making policy, delivering policy, consulting on policy. They're essentially becoming a one-stop shop. And this is fusing with the new media ecosystem. So this online targeting and influence technologies, these media consultancy networks, and governmentality as a service companies. What's really interesting is there's a really kind of we've not really fleshed this out. There's a really interesting biopolitical point here, because what we're seeing people doing is taking these data, this operational data that's collected by the delivery of government services, and they're taking these kind of profiles of prisoners, patients, and offenders that come from that data, and they're actually hybridizing them with traditional consumer profile categories, basically, that these ad agencies and marketing networks create. They're creating these hybrid profiles of sort of citizen consumers, and then projecting these profiles into the category systems that are created by these algorithmic influence infrastructures, so by the big social media networks and stuff. In doing this, they're trying to kind of both reach hard to find groups, they're trying to do this kind of culture shaping stuff, both manufacturing consent for policy in quite a traditional way, but also really trying to reshape what they perceive to be risky cultures of different kinds. And they're doing this behavior change in the moment messaging where, you know, you start to do something that may be illegal or problematic, or something the government doesn't want you to do online. The surveillance targeting detects that and starts to give you these ads. And I've put, oh no, here, because this is basically, yeah, this was our reaction. I think there is clearly some really astonishing stuff going on here, but also quite a lot of potential problems. The first thing we could really, so this is the kind of towards the end of the talk, but kind of essentially some of the issues we've really thought of here are like, there's a real issue of accountability here. So that kind of chicken shop ad that we spoke about before, there was a huge national outcry about this when they realized that, when people realized, the media realized that they were trying to target young Black Londoners by putting anti-knife crime ads in fried chicken shops, and this clearly unpleasant and ill-considered and not good. But with this stuff, with this sort of target online advertising, who actually sees it? Only the people who are being targeted see the ad. So it's much harder to get, it's not like a billboard where everyone going past it sees it. It's much harder for that accountability to happen, where maybe if something problematic is going on, the people that are seeing the ad might not have the links to the media, the capacities, the social capital to actually raise the alarm here. We also think there's the possibility for some, actually, particularly when you get the target advertising stuff coming in, the profiling, for some really bad, unforeseen consequences. So for example, if you are an anxious young person who's within the demographic and the behavioral profile that you are going to be targeted by ads, for example, anti-grooming ads or anti-knife crime ads, if you know the targeting infrastructure suddenly decides you're the key demographic for this, you will be seeing these ads all the time wherever you go on the internet. And I don't know about you, but I think if I went on the internet and just kept everywhere I go getting anti-grooming ads, that potentially would be incredibly stigmatizing, potentially have some really just totally bad unintended consequences as well. And we see this with kind of when this has been used for anti-radicalisation. If it's not done carefully, you can just spread the negative message you're trying to counteract to places that would never necessarily have heard it or thought about it. It's reliant on both very broad and in some ways very deep and personal surveillance. There isn't a lot of oversight of kind of what data are being used, what kind of knowledge about people is being created. And there are some real problems when you're using this operational data to create a theory of change. So we've seen this in the NCA where there are assumptions being baked into these operational processes about what kind of offenders they are looking for, about who they're surveilling, that have the potential to become self-fulfilling prophecies, where we think these people are going to be doing this, therefore we suck them into this kind of collection system, and therefore we reproduce the outcomes we expect. Additionally, a big problem with this is that a lot of this is done by communications professionals, so it's seen as easy, low stakes. The ethical and accountability issues are not being considered necessarily. I think people are really trying in a lot of places to do this in a really good faith way, but it's not being thought of in this kind of operational way I think that it really needs to be. There's also some problems, we've not really spoken about this too much, but where the government starts to use influencers, so paying people who are influential on social networks to support this targeted advertising and put these messages out, there are some potential problems. For example, these people, we've seen some evidence of them using the legitimacy of these government messages to sell their own products, and difficulty in kind of answering follow-up questions about the policies, about the ads, things like this. And finally, there's just a question of efficacy. I mean, it's really difficult to tell what the effects are. For our particular thing, we found a really good way of doing this that we think is fairly robust, but this was a really specialist case where there was a really clear way of counting, for example, the number of this particular type of cybercrime that was occurring. But for most places, it's very difficult to tell actually what is the effect that you're producing. Some just sort of final critical thoughts. This is actually how a great deal of government is being done now. It is very widespread. Everywhere we looked, every government department we looked in, we actually saw some of this going on. And I think some of the stuff I'd like to talk about in the discussion is kind of what people think this actually means for criminal justice. I think it fits into the public health model of criminal justice in a really interesting way. You're seeing both these attempts to shape narratives, broader cultural narratives, but also in some ways, like in our ads, it was people searching for legal services online immediately got these kind of NCA ads coming up. And so there's a sort of almost a kind of digital guardianship aspect within digital spaces. And then there's the kind of broader questions of democratic policing. So how does this fit into participation democracy? Could this be driven by communities? Does this have to be this top-down thing? And there are kind of these broader critiques of the kind of potentially sort of colonial dimensions of how this is used abroad as well. Finally, I'll leave on the kind of reflection that there may well be places where government has a duty to do this. So we initially were quite very skeptical of this and said, you know, this is potentially really problematic. But the more we looked into this, the more we found places where this sort of targeted advertising is already going on. It's just not being used by government, it's being used by malicious actors. So we've had some anecdotal evidence of things like people, gambling companies targeting people based on demographics that they think are going to be particularly vulnerable, and things like this, or kind of your classic sort of YouTube disinformation networks. And potentially there's places where if the government doesn't do anything here, if the government isn't putting out messages in these spaces, that space will simply be taken up by other people who have even less accountability, who are doing this specifically for malicious outcomes. So yeah, just to summarize, this really does seem to be a kind of a new front line of policing and security and government policy more generally. It is being developed and sold as a kind of fully featured technology of government in its own right. We're interested to think, are there any kind of potential positive features about this that we can imagine? We've got some papers in progress. We're hoping to do a lot more research. And we think really the way forward for this, if it's going to be done, it needs to really be conceived of as frontline work, subject to the same conditions of participation, responsiveness, accountability, and democracy. Thank you very much. That's, I realized it was a slightly formless talk, but I hope there's been some useful stuff in there for you. And cheers.